Hi, Catalina Montell. This is your class observation feedback video. First, I will start mentioning the focus areas that you chose at the beginning of the project, and then I will mention the focus area that was chosen by our mentor teacher, Andres Pardo, right? So the first two focus areas that you chose were teaching methodology and formative and summative assessment. And the focus area chosen by our mentor teacher was objectives in teaching and didactic sequence. Sorry. Based on these focus areas, I will start first talking about the first focus area that was teaching methodology. I like the way you introduced the topic to the class. Students had to reflect on the way they create and design their CVs. And during that process, L2 or English was used all the time as a means of communication and as a means of instruction. You foster interactions patterns. For example, I observed some teacher-students interactions. I also observed some students-teacher interactions. English was used all the time for you as a teacher and for the students just to communicate and to interact in the process of designing their curriculums. So that was something very good I liked it of this class observation. Based or continuing with this focus area teaching methodology, something that caught my attention during the class observation was that you used a TBL approach, a task-based learning approach, to foster students to create their own curriculums. You design a very, very good task for the class. Steps were very clear. Students were very aware of what they had to do. You included some ICT sources. They were working in the laboratory. They were designing their curriculums. They were working together sometimes. Even though sometimes they use the Spanish, I also observed some English interactions among them. So that was very good. That caught my attention, that L2 or English was a means of communication and a means of instruction during the whole class. So I was very, very happy to observe that in your class. Regarding some recommendation of improvement, I will tell you just a small question. Have you tried that students, after designing their curriculums, can send them to a real life working position? I think that this exercise or task of ask them to send their curriculums to real life working positions would be a very good experience for them, because they will learn how to structure not only a curriculum, but how to structure maybe an email to send their CVs, or how to structure or to behave in an oral interview in a real life working position. So I would recommend you just to match these kind of tasks to fostering students to apply to real working positions after they designed their CVs, right? And also, sorry, I would recommend you some places or some companies that you and your students can apply to working positions. Citel, for example, Convergys, for example, Sutherland, for example. Those are some companies, inbound companies or call center companies that you can maybe browse on the internet the working positions they have, because they have plenty of them, and ask your students to create an email to send their CVs. And in that process of creating the email, you can foster them and monitor them on the way how an email is structured, what steps we have to follow just to structure an email, and then to ask them to send their CVs to those working real life working positions. I think that it will be something very meaningful for them, not only designing their CVs, but also to send them into real life working positions. Now, based on the second focus area, which was formative and summative assessment, I have to be honest, and I didn't observe activities related to formative and summative assessment. During the class, assessment activities were not included, and I will ask you a question. Have you tried of modeling students on how to apply a real working position? I think that you could model the process. and at the same time guide your students to apply to a real life working position. But first, modeling on how or what steps they have to follow, what steps they have to bear in mind when writing an email to send their CVs, what ideas or steps they have to bear in mind when they are going to face a real interview for a working position. And I think that during this process, you can evaluate them, you can train them, or giving them training about on the way they have to behave, or what things or ideas they have to bear in mind if they are called into a real life interview. So I think that this would be very, very meaningful for them. Not only designing the CVs, but maybe writing an email, sending their CVs into the company, and facing a real life interview maybe in those companies. A recommendation I will give you about this formative and summative assessment focus area, it would be that as a homework, it would have been a good idea for you to ask the students to rehearse on how they could face a real speaking interview. I think that if you set some like models or prompts on the way they can structure an email and on the way what steps they have to follow to organize their ideas to face a speaking interview, I think that modeling that, giving them input about how they must structure an interview would be very, very meaningful for them, because nowadays companies, inbound companies or call center companies are request plenty of people that have A2, B1 levels of English. So I think that making a match between the designing task and applying to a real working position would be so meaningful for them, because they are going to learn for life and not only for the task of your class. And based now on the focus area chosen by our mentor teacher, I realized that your class was very, very well planned and with a pedagogical sequence with meaningful learning objectives. So I think that all the activities and all the tasks you designed during the class, they were well connected, they were very meaningful for the students. I realized also that you took some time just to plan all the things you or you implemented in the class. So really, I felt so happy of being in your class, observing the activities, and of course this was a huge process of planning, and I is something I want to highlight of the class observation I was in. Also, I think that it would be a good idea to write on the board, maybe related to the objectives and didactic sequence, at the beginning of the class, the sequence of activities the students will do during the session, because maybe they were working with you in the activities you designed, you planned, but bear in mind that we have also to foster students autonomously, and it would be good that they can be aware of the learning objectives they are going to achieve in the classes. So maybe by structuring an agenda, a class agenda with the steps and activities they are going to work in, would be a very, very good idea to foster metacognition in the class and on your students' pedagogical discourses. And finally, like a small recommendation, have you tried of creating a class agenda for your teaching sessions? Maybe in a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe listing all the steps you're going to follow in the class. Maybe at the beginning of the class, you write the learning objective, and then you write all the steps or activities you are going to work during the session. So I think that this is something that you could include in your teaching practices, and it would help a lot to your students to reflect on the way they are learning, and sometimes even though they can give you feedback on what things they like and what things they don't like. Sorry. Based on all these feedback I've given you, I would like to mention maybe focus or future continuing professional development focus areas or maybe an action plan that I would recommend you based on the data I gather in the observation class. And I will ask you to focus your attention on students' interactions and objectives and didactic sequence. Based on students' interactions, I think that you must focus your lesson plans and activities on creating students' real interactions. English must be used by them in oral presentations. When you plan your classes, bear always in mind that you need to create real life students' interactions, not asking them to learn things by heart, but to model them and monitor them, just that they can be able to produce real speeches with the grammar and the topics you work in the class. So I think that you can focus your attention on maybe for next year, the first term of the next year, just that your students can create more speeches and more interactions among them and with you and in the class, just to foster the use of L2 in the classes. And finally, regarding the focus area, objectives, and didactic sequence, I think that you should include in your lesson plans a class agenda, or an agenda in which at the beginning of the class, students can know what is the learning objective they are going to have for that hour, those 2 hours of classes, and what steps and what activities they are going to work during the sessions, and what is expected that they produce for each activity of the classes, and at the end of the class as a product, if you are using a task-based approach. I think that this would be my 2 recommendations for the next year: foster more students' interactions, and to maybe adjust the objectives or the way you are presenting the objectives of the classes and the sequence of the activities you are developing in your classes by including agendas. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for allowing me to be in your class. I was so happy. Congratulations. See you next year.